to part 2 of our Florence and Flowers instructional video. First of all, thank you for buying one of our DIY Christmas festive kits. We very much appreciate your support for our small business, particularly during what's been quite a difficult year for 2020. So, this stage of the video is going to show you how to attach all of the lovely foliage and the dried flowers that you've got within your kit. We've included quite a lot of different materials. We've included lots of different foliages, different colours, different textures. That's going to really help to make your finished product look quite full and interesting. If there's certain things in there that you don't particularly like, by all means feel free to leave them out. There should be enough material that you can kind of pick and choose what it is that you would like to include in your finished product. So at this stage you should have a completed moss ring, which will look something like this. Don't worry if little bits are dropping off, that doesn't make any difference whatsoever. You can just leave those. As long as you've got a nice sort of even coverage around there, it's absolutely fine. So, when you're working, try to make sure that you're keeping your piece of twine out of the way of where you're binding on material. If you have it kind of hanging down, there's a chance that as you're putting things on, you're going to kind of bind your twine in at the same time, and you'll get to the end and realise that you've got nothing left to hang it up with. So, nice pair of sharp scissors. And I would always start with something like the Christmas tree, spruce, fir, pine, something like that. It's nice and rigid, it's got some nice structure to it, and it means that when it goes on, it's going to kind of support the other foliage that you may lay on top of it, whereas some of the other things might be a little bit more kind of flippy floppy, and they might kind of dangle down and affect the overall shape at the end. So I would start with something like this. You can cut it at a kind of natural break in the branch. That way you'll be able to use longer pieces in a couple of sections. You'll get more out of your material. How big your finished wreath is will depend on 2 things. So it will depend on how big you've cut your sprigs. I normally go for around sort of 15-20 centimetres, something like that. If you want something, it might be that you're laying your wreath on your kitchen table and putting candles or something in the centre. You might want it laying flat, so you might want to keep it a much smaller, neater circle, in which case you might want to cut things a little bit smaller so that you can actually still fit your plates on your dining table at the end. The other thing that's going to make a difference to how big your finished wreath will be is how you angle the foliage when you put it on. If you've got it all kind of facing outwards at quite an obtuse angle, then it's going to be quite a whopper of a wreath at the end, which is absolutely fine, nothing wrong with that. But if you wanted it to be quite small and neat, then you'd probably want to bind it on and just keep it a little bit sort of tighter as you go round, so that you're not kind of angling it way out here. So, I start with something like that, and then I would add on an extra couple of things. So maybe a bit of this nice red eucalyptus and a piece of this nice variegated foliage here. So we've got our first little sprig, and we're going to bind that on using the binding wire that we've already got attached to the wreath, which we used for the moss. If you got to the end of the first video and you cut your wire off, then just tie it back on. And again, if you pull it way too tight and it snaps, just tie it back onto the ring, it's really not a problem. So first sprig, and we're laying it on top of the mossed ring. So if you have a good look at where the stems are here, my finger and thumb are touching the inner and outer edges of the ring, and I've got my stems quite nicely positioned in the centre of that. If you try to do it so that the stems are all facing inwards like this, you're going to find it a lot harder to cover up the wire from each sprig that you bind on, and you're also probably going to end up with a very, very big wreath at the end. So to make it look nice and tidy, we're putting it on at this kind of angle, binding round with the wire 2 or 3 times, pulling it nice and tight. If you do it too loose and the foliage is kind of moving about, there is a danger that you're going to put it on your door, there's going to be a gust of wind and you're going to lose half your foliage down the road. So pulling it nice and tight, putting the first piece on. Then we do second piece. So again, start with maybe some Christmas tree, a couple of bits of Christmas tree, cut them to length, find something else, maybe something a bit different to what you used in your first branch, just to kind of mix it up a bit. So I've got some of that, got some of that nice ivy with the berries on it. I'm going to cut some of them a little bit shorter, so I'm not having everything kind of cut to the same length. If I have this piece and he's a little bit shorter, then I can see this behind and this behind and then this in the foreground. So the next piece is going to go on in exactly the same way, but we're pushing it up nice and close, overlapping almost that first little bunch that we put on. There's the wire from the first sprig, and if I lay this on top like that, then I'm covering that up and I'm pulling round nice and tight 2 or 3 times like so. What you might like to do is put something smaller on the inner part of the circle. Again, that will help to make it look really full at the end. So sometimes if I'm making a wreath, every 2 or 3 big sprigs that I put on, I'll then put a little sprig on the inside, just to cover up any of that sort of inner edge. But you don't have to do that. To just put on sprig, big sprigs all the way around is absolutely fine, and we'll end up with a beautiful wreath. So third piece going on, starting with Christmas tree again. By now you know the drill. So that piece, and a nice piece of laurel. It's got a nice big shiny leaf. I'm going to pull you off though, because you're back to front. Ooh, I don't want you in there. At this point, I'm also going to incorporate a little bit of my dried material. So we've got some lovely bunny's tails in this one. Like I say, they do all vary, so what you get in your kit might not be the same as what's in everybody else's. And I've got a bit of dried eucalyptus. So cutting the stems so they're roughly the same length, and then again kind of pushing that up nicely against the other material that I've bound on, and using the third sprig to overlap the wires from the second and binding it on. So keep turning the ring as you're putting things on, and every now and then just pick it up and have a little look at it. Look at it like that. But it's also really useful to look at it from the back. The reason I say that is when you look at something from the front, there's so much busyness going on, there's so much colour and texture and things to detract the eye that it becomes a little bit distracting. If you look at it from the back, you can see a bit clearer the shape that you're creating with your foliage that you're binding on, and then you can see quite rapidly if you're making any errors or if you're going wrong. There is absolutely no right or wrong way to make your wreath, but generally people like it to be a fairly consistent width all the way round. It's quite nice sometimes if they're a bit more elliptical, but if you're looking to have something more consistent, then by turning it round and looking at it from the back, you'll be able to see quite quickly if you've kind of put something in and it's coming right out, or if it's coming right in. You know, if you've suddenly kind of come down here because you've cut your branches too short or you've angled them differently, then you can always just unbind the wire and redo it and put the next bits in. There should be plenty of material, so if you make a couple of mistakes and you cut things too short or you need to take them off, you'll have enough to kind of make a few mistakes with. So keep working your way around the circle, binding things on, including your dried flowers, binding those on in exactly the same way as you do the fresh material. and then we'll come back for part 3, which is when we put on the pine cones and the orange slices.